Welcome again to the Brand Ambassador series.
Absolutely.
And this man looks a bit familiar. This is David Blackmore.
Cheers.
But we're talking about Ardbeg.
Yes.
This is not Glenmorangie, this is Ardbeg.
Absolutely.
Ardbeg, we jump to Isla.
Uh-huh.
And, well, we talk about Pete.
Yes.
Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Let's
Pleasure.
get smoking.
Yes, let's get smoking.
Who's, what, where?
So, yeah, Ardbeg Distillery was acquired by the then Glenmorangie Company in 1997 and basically saved from annihilation. Ardbeg had been not really cared for a long time. You're talking sort of a couple of decades of neglect at the Ardbeg Distillery by the previous owners. And it was kind of understandable back then. You know, single malts weren't that popular, and thanks to the people that frequent the brandy library, the regeneration of the single malt whiskey industry is in full flurry, and distilleries have their lights on again. But back, in the 80s and even the early 90s, that wasn't the case. And single malt distilleries were basically production plants, many of them, to produce single malt to go into blends.
Right.
The company that owned Glenmorangie at the time, the company that owned Ardbeg at the time, also owned Lafroig next door. And if you're making blends with these whiskies, you don't really need two heavily peaty, smoky whiskies. So Ardbeg was kind of left by the wayside. It wasn't really invested in. It was laid dormant for a long time. A few of the passionate souls who worked at Lafroig came over and ran small batches at Ardbeg for a while, and then we had some very dark days when the distillery was completely closed. 97, the distillery was faced with demolition. Last ditch attempt, a few companies bid to buy what was left of the distillery, and Glenmorangie Company won that bid. And we bought the distillery in 97, and we had a lot of work to do just to put the fabric of the building and the distills back together. We spent the rest of 97 putting that back together, and we started distilling in any significant way in 98, which jump forward to 2008, and of course that's the first year where the Ardbeg 10-year-old is really our own creation from soup to nuts all the way through. And it's fantastic that 2008 was the year that the 10-year-old won World Whiskey of the Year with Jim Murray's Whiskey Bible.
Right.
So that
but
was
in 97?
Yeah.
Are we talking about a lot of stocks?
No. That's what I was going to get to.
But how do you acquire
huge problem.
A distillery without the stocks?
Yeah, very minimal stocks of whiskey when we buy the site and the distillery. There's nothing being distilled really, minimal distillation happening for the best part of 20 years. We were very lucky that we were able to, and this is where the Scotch whisky industry, thankfully, to this day, is a little different from most industries in that we actually see the communal benefit of clumping together and working together sometimes, even though we compete very competitively for market share and such like around the world. We were able to procure some casks of Ardbeg that had been distilled prior to our ownership of the distillery and had been sold to blenders. So we managed to we're not giving them back, we bought them, but at least we had the opportunity to do so. And that really helped us. And but basically we still had a big problem with the stock. We had very little.
Is there any left out of?
I can't get into details, but there's still some of that. When we bought the distillery, what we had effectively was some whiskey distilled in the mid-70s. Okay. And that plus a little tiny packet from those guest distilling periods when some of the guys from Lafroig came over.
Guest distilling, you see.
Yeah, almost guest distilling. It was that's the wrong word.
Guest bartenders and you've got guest distillers.
It was almost that way, and it was these guys that thank God for them. They came over and did some distilling just out the sort of goodness of their heart because they were passionate about the whiskey as we are.
This is a great whiskey.
Yeah.
We all saw that article in the New York Times.
Yeah, fantastic.
Out of the very first few, out of first 4 or 5, Ardbeg comes twice.
Yeah, absolutely.
But comes twice with the 10,
Yeah, absolutely.
it makes sense.
Yeah.
But with that newbie,
Correct, absolutely. Well, first thing off, let's taste the 10, because like with Glenmorangie,
it's good. It's for the job.
the 10 is the quintessential Ardbeg. And again, we talked about it when we did the Glenmorangie session, but if anyone was to ever question whether this whole idea that older is necessarily better with single malts, well, I'm sorry, that's just wrong. And Ardbeg 10-year-olds, it came number 3 in the New York Times list, as tasted by Eric Asimov and Florence Fabricant. It was World Whiskey of the Year in 2008 from Jim Murray. This is a fantastic single malt at, just 10 years old. The second point, this is a great whiskey for debunking these myths about single malts. Oh my God, it's so young, it can't be any good. Wrong. Secondly, oh my God, it's so light in color, it can't have any flavor. Well, evidently completely wrong.
Well, but let's play the devil's advocate here. I would say it doesn't have to be old.
No.
It doesn't have to be dark in color. Yeah. Because there's a lot of peat there.
Absolutely, and this is where we normally say that in general in the single malt whiskey industry, 70% of the flavor comes from the cask. Well, here it's probably a little less because of the significant influence of the phenols, as you would measure them as phenolic content, and this is the smokiness coming from.
What are we talking about when it comes to Ardbeg? If you can locate that in comparison to Lagavulin and Lafroig, well,
absolutely, and don't get me wrong, Islay is the mecca for many people for the single malt whiskey world, and whether you like smoky whiskies or not, you have to at least appreciate them for what they are, which is undeniably fantastic. And Islay is where the sort of the seat of the smoky whiskey world, where all the smokiest, best single malts come from. When we're talking about smokiness as it appears in a single malt, it comes from dried peat that is burnt as a fuel to dry the barley.
Okay.
And the barley picks up the smoke from that burning peat, and then you treat the barley just like any other when you're creating a single malt, and those phenols, those chemicals from the smoke, survive everything you do from milling to mashing to fermentation to distillation to maturation to bottling. So you get the actual smoke molecules from the peat in your whiskey. That's where it comes from. Don't believe anyone that tells you it's because the water trickling off the moorlands of Scotland pick up a peatiness from running over the peat bogs. It's utter nonsense. That's the polite version. Right? Okay, so it's coming from the dried, combusted peat. Looking at 50 to 65 parts per million phenols, and in reality we are trying to aim at the top end of that at all times. So we're really pushing towards 65 parts per million phenols with Ardbeg 10. Of course, that's not the smokiest single malt ever made in the history of mankind. Ardbeg Supernova is evidence to that, as is our boys over at Brookladdy with Octomore. And there was a bit of a, fair to say, a bit of an Islay arms race a couple of years ago. All good fun, but that's the point. Supernova and Octomore are special releases. As a single malt that's readily available, you should be able to find in just about any liquor store anywhere around the world. Ardbeg 10, 65 parts per million as our aim, but no less than 50, is significantly smokier. Our closest neighbours, the big brutes of the South Shore of Islay, Lafroig and Lagavulin, and great single malts, don't get me wrong, wonderful. But you're talking phenolic content of, we think about 40 to 45 parts per million for both of those. And then you're looking at, the other guys on the island, a couple of them are not into the peat so much. But comparing to a mainland single malt, there's still plenty there for some reason. It just seems to be there. But you know, even Kalila, you're talking sort of high teens, low 20 parts per million phenols usually. You're talking 65 parts per million here.
But on Isla,
Yeah.
distilleries, as we just mentioned,
Yeah.
switch ownerships. There's one owner, then there's another one. Cash flow varies, and some distilleries stop sherry butt maturation, go to white oak, ex-American oak.
Yeah.
What do we deal with here at Ardbeg?
So with Ardbeg 10-year-old, it's 100% American white oak, the same specification of white oak that we use for Glenmorangie. So first and second fill only.
Okay.
Our own Glenmorangie company contracts with the loggers to create these. We know the provenance of our casks.